And welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I am one of the programming librarians at the Cary Memorial Library in Lexington, Massachusetts. I know we have people here from all over the world, so I'm really excited to welcome our authors here, and I'll tell you more about them in just a minute. So first of all, we are doing this as part of FaRoFeb, which is Fantasy Romance February, which we will talk about more in just a second as well. I do want to let you know that I've enabled captions on this webinar, so I will put instructions in the chat on how to use them if you would like to use closed captioning for while you're here. We would like to thank the Cary Library Foundation, which supports all of our adult programming. We could not do this without them. We are recording this and live streaming on Facebook. You can ask questions in either place. In here, you would put it in the Q&A on Facebook. Just throw your questions in, and I'll ask the authors as it comes up. And we're using the chat just as you are for comments and tech issues. So I am going to go into introducing our wonderful authors who are here with us today. First up is Emma Hamm. She writes strong, confident, powerful women who aren't afraid to grow and make mistakes. Her books will always be a little feminist and are geared towards empowering both men and women to be comfortable in their own skins, something that we all really need to pay attention to. Heinrich, who is Trish, here you'll see, writes some of my favorite kinds of books, superheroes, and she started a little bit later in life because she had lots going on, just as we all do. But at one point, she just said, you know what, I'm doing it. And she has braved the constant attacks of her nemesis, evil inner critic, in no time in order to achieve the impossible, an artistic life with 2 small kids. That is superheroic to me, having had kids myself. Penelope, Leslie, who is here, was born in the Bronx just after the birth of hip hop, but left before she could acquire an accent. I wonder why. She's an award-winning independent filmmaker, co-founded a literary magazine, and sometimes dreams in HTML. Interesting. I think Freud would have something to say about that. And H.R. Moore, Harriet, is British, but lives in New Hampshire. And she occasionally, she's super busy just like everybody else. When she's not writing, she's editing, eating, running around after her kids. And she occasionally finds time to make hats, which I would like to hear a little bit more about at some point. Harriet is the founder of FaRoFeb, Fantasy Romance February, a month-long online event celebrating the fantasy romance genre. So we're actually going to start with that. Harriet, if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about what it is, and then I'll come back and I'll ask questions of all of the authors.
Yeah, sure. And thank you for having us. It's really exciting to be here. And hello to everyone from around the world. It's exciting to see lots of people someone from Yorkshire, so that's nice. Anyway, I am Harriet Moore. I write under the pen name H.R. Moore, and yeah, I set up Fantasy Romance February, which is a month-long online celebration of the fantasy romance genre. I found it really frustrating that I know that there are loads of awesome authors and awesome books in this genre, but after you've read maybe the 1 or 2 bigger names, it's often quite difficult to find your next read. And it's difficult, they're categorized, the way they're categorized isn't particularly good, it's not easy to find your next read. So I was like, oh, it would be great just to have a way to bring authors and readers in the genre together, hopefully try and raise the profile of the genre, and just kind of have a celebration and do some fun things to engage readers and authors at the same time. So it's been running for the whole of February, so we've only got a week left, and every day in February we've been spotlighting a different fantasy romance author. So if you are looking for some new reads and you want to find some new authors, you can go onto our Instagram feed, which is at FaRoFeb, FaRoFeb, and you can see all of the authors that we have already spotlighted. There's some awesome people on there. I think everyone on this call has already had their spotlight. And we've got another week's worth as well. And we've also got giveaways. We've created 2 micro stories, especially for the event. We've got panels like this one. We've got polls, all kinds of things going on. So you can definitely check us out on Instagram. you can check out the website, which is www.FaRoFeb.com, and we've also got a reader group on Facebook. So come join the party if you haven't already.
Well, thank you. That's wonderful. I'm putting links in the chat for people to find you, so they can learn more as we go. So I'm going to start with the questions. My first one is just really to tell us about your most recent book, what it's about, what made you write it, what was your inspiration for it, and I'm gonna start with Emma for that question, then I'll just go around.
Sure. So my most recent book is called Of Goblins and Gold. It was definitely a bit of a homage to my David Bowie obsession when I was young. So yeah, it leans hard on kind of the more classic stories of the Fae in general. So you've got your different seasonal courts and this one goblin king who tends to kidnap children. And just like their deep dive into that. Most of my books you'll find are about some sort of fae or fairy tale. Tend to like the monster men, but that would be mine.
Thank you. Leslie.
The latest book is Cry of Metal and Bone, which is the third book in the Earthsinger Chronicles. And it's about a disgraced socialite who you've met in earlier books, and a smuggler who is also like smuggler, pirate, captain of a ship. And they are opposites that are attract and are put on a mission after a terrorist attack in the capital of Elsera, which was one of my countries. And so they have to go on a journey with some other characters and stop a future terrorist attack from happening. So it's under the auspices of the entire series. I have heard that it can stand alone. I don't know how well it does, but yeah, that is the latest one. So it's a third of the 4-book series, and the last book comes out later this year.
Well, as somebody who always reads everything in order, that would be me. I would say read them in order.
Yeah,
especially fantasy romance series, because there's so much world building going on, and we'll get into that in a sec. Trish, what's your latest book?
So it's a romance anthology that I have a partner that a fellow author that we work to bring more visibility to superhero fiction in particular, since it's hard to find it really on Amazon. And so our authors and us, we put together a romance anthology. So I have a short story in there that's kind of a prequel to my upcoming romance series that's going to be out this summer. But my latest full-length novel was the second in my Heroes of High Tide book. It is the second book following our pyrokinetic heroine, Colleen, as she tries to save her neighborhood from a very mysterious villain. And we get to meet her brother finally with his ice powers. We get to see what her mother is up to, which may or may not be as nefarious as we once thought. And we also get to meet her new love interest in that. And so there's a lot that goes on in that book. Right now, it's my only lesbian superhero romance series. And it's called Fire and Ice. And the first book is Fahrenheit's Ghost.
Thank you. I love that. I'm looking forward to meeting that brother. Harriet, what's new for you?
Yeah, so I just re-released the second book in the Relic trilogy, which is Temple of Sand. The trilogy, I wouldn't start in the middle. I would start with the first book, which is Queen of Empire, and it's set in another world, so it's epic fantasy romance, but it's in a world that feels quite contemporary, and the concept of energy is really kind of central to the whole book. So the whole magic system hinges around this kind of concept of energy, and everyone's personal energy splits into either mind, body, or spirit is their kind of major area of personal energy. And so everything in the world is split into those 3 areas. And there are ruling families and temples and gods that all represent one of those different areas. And Queen of Empire follows Anita, who is a very skilled body, but she also has a lot of spirit skills. And the ruling body descendant dies. That causes a whole crisis with the world's energy because of the bloodlines. And then the main characters have to try and navigate that against quite a political backdrop. So it's quite a lot to kind of get your head around, but once you're in, it's a very fast-paced love triangle, because she's involved with two of the younger descendants. It's not an annoying love triangle, but it's a good one.
I was going to cough into my hands and say Twilight, but I didn't.
And slightly older, like not quite so high school.
Yeah.
Oh, that's funny. Moira asks, and this is a really good question that was on my list as well. How do you approach limiting your characters so that they aren't all powerful and feed into the cliche of magic solves everything? And I'm going to start with Leslie for that one.
I do think about that a lot when designing a magic system. I have like a little chart that I use. So whenever I'm creating a new magic system, it's like, how is it used? Like gesture, mannerism, speech. Do you need special things? How do you acquire the power? Are you born with it, or do you have to go to school to learn it? And what are the costs? Those are the kind of the biggest questions. So what stops the people from having this magic from taking over the world? How are they not all powerful gods in this country or in this world, even if they are seemingly all powerful? And so there's different ways you can approach it depending on how you're building your system. I kind of took the approach where, they have so much and then they can run out. It's like a muscle. You get exhausted after a while and you have to rest it. And then it kind of rebuilds whatever your capacity is. But there's lots of different examples of that. And then in terms of magic solving everything, that's a plotting issue too, where you kind of have to think about the limits, not just in personally, but also what it actually accomplishes in the world. And the more I find that the more I know about the limits of it at the beginning of the process, then I can plot in a way so that I know exactly what the magic can and can't do. And you always have more room for conflict when it can't do everything, when it has some like real limitations to it.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. Trish?
It was a little difficult at first because you don't want to fall into the Superman syndrome, which is basically nothing can hurt Superman but a little rock. And I didn't want it to be that I pulled out the same trope every time I wanted to limit my superpowers. So for instance, Colleen, who can create and manipulate fire, I have it be that it actually, she draws on her powers, but it takes away energy from her body. So if she doesn't drink a lot of fluids, if she doesn't eat often enough and enough food, then she will pass out. I have another character that he manipulates emotions, so he can make people relive their worst nightmares or their worst fears. But if he overuses it, or he lets it go too long, it will kind of overtake him, and suddenly he loses control of those powers, and he kind of becomes lost in those people's emotions. And so I tried to find a limitation that fit the logic of each power, I guess. And it depends on what kind of superpower I want to pull out. Like the ice powers, for instance, he'll run out of steam kind of quite literally. Like if it's too hot, he can't really draw enough moisture, So it was just trying to figure out, okay, what would logically make sense as a limitation here. And I've only run into one problem with one character that I did make a little too much like Superman. I'm like, all right, we need to figure out how to draw this guy back in. But yeah, it's kind of a case by case basis for me.
Mm-hmm. I always think of that TV show on Amazon Prime. Is it Bad Boys or something
Boys.
about
Boys?
Yeah. When I read your books, I think of that.
Oh, thank you.
Because they have sort of taken over, they've become really evil because they have all these powers and no limit, seemingly no limit.
Yeah.
So I enough about me. Harriet?
I tend not to write like really all powerful powers because I don't personally find them as interesting as kind of just pushing the boundaries of what we can do. So that was kind of the whole concept of energy in my trilogy, is around, wouldn't it be cool if you could just push the boundaries of the things that we're able to do? So that feeling where like you walk into a room and like it's really tense and you're like, oh, something is definitely going on here, but you can feel that. And I was like, oh, wouldn't it be great if you could really feel it, and you could feel it all the time, and it was like a skill that someone had that they could kind of navigate how people are feeling by their energy. So it's, that has its own limitations, because it's not like something that you kind of relies on other people. It relies on them showing you, that people can kind of learn how to get around the magic that you are able to do. And so all of our own human limitations also would factor in. So for people with lots of body energy, they would be able to run faster, do all of those kind of physical things better and for longer than we would. But again, they would eventually get tired, and that, they would eventually run out of energy. So it's just sort of the magic systems I like and tend to create tend to just kind of push the boundaries. So you've still got a lot of our limitations anyway.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Emma.
I sort of approach magic in the same way I approach character building. There has to be a flaw. And if there's no flaw, then the character actually ends up being more boring than you're anticipating. Like Superman is not that popular compared to Captain America. Maybe you can compare the two of them for hours. So generally speaking with mine, I sort of like to play with that all powerful, because I do think that it's an interesting tactic to give somebody like infinite power, but give them this just massive personality flaw where they just can't use it right ever, just because of who they are. They're, super arrogant, so they think they can do this one thing, but then they don't think of all the other factors, and it just crumbles. So you can go that route, or you can go like physicality, you can go emotionally. There's a ton of different ways, and I think it's super important, and that sets you apart from other series, definitely.
Well, thank you. So Madison on Facebook wants to know, one of my favorite questions is, are you a pantser or a plotter? And I think this particular question for fantasy romance is really interesting, because you do have to build a world, but is that the first thing that happens? And are you a pantser or a plotter in that sense as well? And I'm going to start with Trish this time.
I tend to sketch, I do a rough sketch of what I want plot wise. So I'll have a general idea, beginning, a middle, and an end. And then I discover the rest of it kind of as I go. So I guess I'm a little bit of both when it comes to the plot. In terms of the world building, when I first started the superhero series, my Vigilantes universe, I had I wanted to keep it simple. So I put it in an alt history past, and I said, okay, I'm just going to I picked a superhero origin trope, which in my case is people get superpowers because of an experiment that somebody did. Okay, well, what was the experiment and how far reaching was it? And so I just kind of started asking those questions and created a framework for myself. As I wrote the stories, a little bit more of the details started to come to me in terms of what was their original reason for this? How many labs were there? Those kinds of things. For me personally, I find when I try to dig down and outline everything, my brain just comes to a screeching halt. It's like my creativity goes nowhere. So if I have a framework, if I have kind of a general direction, for me, I find that I can find my way, and that includes kind of filling in some of the details of the world as well.
So I think we need to add a third category of a plotzer.
Yeah. I would probably fall into that, honestly.
Harriet.
Yeah, I'm relating hard to the plotter. So I thought I was a proper plotter, planner, because, well, I just am. And, I like to be organized. I like to kind of know what's coming. And then I heard Maria Vale talk the other day, and she was saying that she was trying to emulate another author who had like spreadsheets with every single facet of everybody's everything in a spreadsheet, and I was like, not sure that would work for me. So so then I had to rein back my own views of myself as a planner into somewhere in between a planner and a pantser, and so I think that makes a lot of sense. So for me, I tend to come up with an idea, and it, it's just usually it's just like a kernel of an idea, and then it kind of grows from there. And it'll kind of percolate for a while in my mind, and then I will kind of, usually I get somewhere near the start and kind of think, okay, this is kind of the status quo where we're going to start, and I'll then start kind of writing out sections, literally just like writing a few lines and number each of the sections and say, okay, this happens and then this happens and this happens. And, obviously kind of fleshing out the characters, and I'll usually get maybe 25 or 30 kind of sections done, and I'll be like, okay, that's as far as I can go. I know what my arc is going to be generally. I kind of know where they're going. I kind of know I might have sketched a map. I might have done, all of that kind of stuff. But I'll be like, okay, I know that these 30 sections are going to happen, and then I'll go backwards and forwards in between them and kind of scribble, oh no, actually I've got here and I want something else to happen back here. So, it'll evolve as I go along. And I think the magic system also, to the specific question about fantasy, that also evolves through that process. So I'll have a good outline of what I think the magic's going to be like. And then as I'm going through the plot, I'll say, oh, okay, well, hang on a minute, I need to change this. And so I can just go back and kind of scribble on some of the earlier bits. And then as I'm writing, I just literally tick off those sections, which is very motivational. And then, I then will pause at some point and say, okay, I now know enough about what's happened that I can plan out the next 10 or 15 sections or whatever it happens to be, that I kind of know what's going to happen. And then I also find it good in terms of helping keep everything quite tight, because, every section has something happen. It's like, well, this is the thing that's happening in this section to move the story forward. So it also helps me write in quite a concise way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Emma?
Yeah, I'm a plotter. So I kind of go about my books in my series a little more analytically than most authors that I know. I am one of those people that's like spreadsheet addicted. So I usually go by an 8-point plot system for like introduction. What is the conflict? Where's your climax? What's your solution? You can Google it. It's all over the place. But I do that before I start writing for every book in the series. And then I usually am about 2 books ahead of where I'm writing, but I sort of write the book before I write it, if that makes sense. So every chapter I have like 2 or 3 paragraphs explaining in detail everything that's going to happen. And then I put links to like Pinterest images that kind of gave me inspiration, or Instagram links. A lot of illustrators and photographers have some like very inspiring, just vivid images that help. So that tends to be how I get it all figured out. And then I get my playlist ready, and I listen to music way too much until eventually I never want to listen to that song again. And then it's done.
Emma, does that evolve? Has that evolved? Because I know you've written a lot of books. Has that evolved as you've gone through?
Oh, for sure. My first series that I wrote, I just did it. I didn't even know that I wanted to be a writer. It was sort of a dare. Somebody was like, we write on online forums with other people because we can't write a book. And I said, well, I can write a book. So I did it at my job at the time, which I don't suggest people do. But the more I started writing, the more it was like, oh, okay, this is a real job. The more I started getting a little better about it, because for me, stuff starts falling in between like the cracks. Like I'll forget like, oh, I wrote this in book 1, and then in book 4, I really need to resolve that. I just won't work.
I also wonder if people that have long running series, went from sort of a pantser to a plotter, because how can you keep all of that straight if you don't? Like Cresley Cole comes to mind. Like how can she possibly know, what she wrote in book 4 when she's on book 20? So Leslie, what are you, a pantser or a plotter, or somewhere in the middle?
I do definitely consider myself a plotter. I'm a spreadsheet person. I've developed a spreadsheet over time, so now it has like 10 or 11 tabs in it. So a lot of these books are plotting books. So I like different plotting systems, and I'll start with one. Like I'll start, once I have the idea formed, I'll put it through like Save the Cat, and that's a plotting system. And then I'll maybe put it through 2 or 3 other ones, because they're all very similar. They call things by different names, and they have slightly different points in them. but in general, they're, you can lay them over top of each other. And so I kind of like to test the idea with different plotting systems. And then I'll come up with a synopsis, which is usually anywhere from like 7 to 15 pages for the book. And once I have the synopsis, then I'm ready to write. Now, even with that, like, it always changes, especially by the time I get to the midpoint. I'm pretty good at plotting pretty accurately up until the middle of the book. And inevitably, the last half is going to veer off in some other direction. I end the same place because I have to know where I'm going. But things in the second half tend to be mobile. So yeah, I love to plot, but in between that all, I still feel like I'm pantsing. Like I know all of these points, but like even a 15-page outline is not 130,000 words. So I'm still discovering things as I go and refining. And every few chapters, I'll go back and look at my outline or my plot points and just make sure that I'm still going where I think I'm going and tweak them. So maybe it's plotzing, but I do still, because there's so much planning and so many tabs in the spreadsheet, I definitely call myself a plotter. And then the magic system is similar. Like I start out with like my chart and knowing the points and knowing what the magic system does. And as you write, you do discover more things. And I try to remain a little bit flexible while staying true to the story. And yeah, so I know as much as I can know to begin with. And that helps me finish on my deadlines. Because once I started having to write under deadlines, everything had to change about my process. And the plotting and the pre-planning has made it possible to hit some pretty difficult deadlines over the past few years.
Mm-hmm. Which actually brings up a question that I had about what starts first for you, character building or world building, because this came up in another one, and Amanda Boucher is here and had an interesting thought on that. And I'm actually wondering what yours is as well, because it wasn't what I expected. She had an answer that really surprised me. So what starts the book for you in terms of, is it world building or character building or something else? And I'll start with Harriet for this one.
It depends. So for my trilogy, it was the magic system. I got some feedback. Someone told me they thought I had a lot of energy. I was like, I don't really think I do. I'm not that person that has to go for a run every day. And that made me kind of sparked an idea about, okay, well, maybe there are different types of energy. And so that's really where it started for that. I wrote a near future sci-fi romance. And for me, again, that was about the concept. Someone told me about universal basic income, which is, we don't need to get into here, but it's something that we might run into in the near future. It's very into my other life as doing change and innovation work, and that just captured my imagination, and that kind of, I was like, okay, I want to write something in that future world. And then my latest one that I've just finished is around reincarnation and and having nations of people, and I really love. So I think I'm more structurally driven really than I am. But then having said that, I've got another one that's percolating at the moment, which is really, I have like a very strong person in my mind. So that's the thing that everything is hinging around. So I think for me, it can really be anything. It can be like just a kernel of an idea or a magic system or a person. It could be any of those things.
So it's really more like book driven as opposed to any of those particular things. Like, what's a book going to be about?
Yeah, like idea driven, it's like, what's the idea that's interesting enough to me that I want to keep going with it.
Emma?
Sort of the same. It depends on the series. Also, if I want to write fantasy romance or romantic fantasy, if I'm leaning more romantic fantasy and like it's about them, then it has to be a character. Just because if you don't have somebody that is just immediately draws you in and you're super excited about their relationship, then it doesn't matter how good your world building is. The point is the romance, and you didn't do it right. If I'm doing fantasy romance, which is very much world building, like Seas of Crimson Silk or Heart of the Fae, for me, it's more like Harriet said, like an idea. I want to have a way of showing people an emotion with my books. And I want to be able to kind of manipulate that while they're reading it, which sounds a little like devious, but It's true. So, you know, with Seas of Crimson Silk, the entire point of the first book is to hate them. Like they're young and annoying and they don't know what they're doing. So you should not like them. And then, you know, Heart of the Fae, it was the idea of like taking people back to that fairy tale, that first moment when you watch Beauty and the Beast, like that first scene with I think, was it Kate Blanchett or somebody who voiced that? Like that was the thing that I was like, I want people to feel like that reading the entire book. So it's usually sort of a spark.
Wow. Leslie.
Yeah, similar answer. I usually either get an image in my head, like Song of Blood and Stone, I wrote because I had an image in my head. There were actually two images. It was from the very beginning of the book. There's a character who's a captive and he gets knocked down. He comes back up and he's got this like really fierce look on his face. And I saw that expression. And it was actually a clip from a movie. Like I was watching a movie and the character was standing up with this crazy expression on his face. And I was like, ooh. And the second image was a girl on her porch with a shotgun. And these people are coming towards her home. And so like those were the opening images. I didn't know who these people were. I didn't know what the situation was. I knew nothing about the world or the magic system. I had these images. I've written other books, like I had a question in my head, like what would happen if a girl falls in love with an invisible boy? And that became a paranormal romance. And so it can be, but usually it's like a tiny kernel, like whether it's an image or a question or just like I have written down on here, not magic, like magic with knots. I don't know what that means. It's going to be maybe a future book, maybe it won't be, but like that could be, if I think about it long enough, I'll figure out a magic system for like tying knots, and then a world will come out of that, and the story and the characters and the conflict come out of that tiny little grain. So I think it's kind of very similar to what everyone else was saying.
Trish.
Again, very similar. This is kind of wild. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm not the only one that does this. It'll be a kernel of an idea, or it'll also be in terms of the superhero series in particular. I would get so frustrated watching shows or movies, or even some of the really good DC cartoons, and you know, fall in love with this amazing female character, only to have her be killed in order to motivate the male hero, which is called fridging, in case anybody doesn't know what that is. Or she'd be depowered because she's too powerful. Oh no. And I'm like, you know what? I'm so annoyed by this. And there was one point my husband was like, why don't you just write your own? And I was like, why don't I? And that kind of sparked it for me, in general for the superhero universe. But in terms of like drilling down into each individual book and character, it can be anything. The first trilogy, Rise of Heroes in particular, was a song by the nerd rock band Kirby Crackle. Just this great song about between like the hero and the woman he loves, and how we can't be together today, you know, but we will be together someday, and you're the person that, you know, helps me, you're my hero, and you know, I can be me with you. And I thought, who are these people? What would that story be like, you know? And the song starts off, they met on the playground and she'd been pushed down and he went and helped her, and I thought, oh my gosh, that's so sweet. How would that work? And then my mind just kind of went down the rabbit hole of it. And for me, one of my favorite questions is, what if this character did that? What if instead of doing this, they did that? Or here lately, it's also been, well, I don't like how they did this. Like, you know, I don't like how this series ended. I don't like how this movie did this. Well, then how would I do it? And so that's another question that kind of gets my motor revving. But I think really for me, it's about a character. It's about a couple of characters. It's about that relationship. It's about the choices that they make. And I just let my mind kind of run with it. And then I have to be like, okay, well, I need to figure out how it fits in the world. I need to figure out a story now, because I have the images of where I want them to go, but I have no idea how to get them there. And that'll kick me off into a plot.
Thank you. It's fascinating that you all do have, and I'm wondering if maybe it's because it's a similar genre, but if that doesn't seem right because you're just such individual people and writers. So that's curious to me. I have a quick question on Facebook from Danica asking, do you write in Scrivener or Word, Google Docs? So just really quick, what do you write in, Emma?
ForTheWords.com.
Oh, okay.
Dogs
I
are
was
very-
actually gonna ask, we should throw in their longhand just because, but
yeah.
so
I use For the Words just because it's fun and it's like a little video game style. You get to like kill monsters as you write more words. It definitely helps with how many words you're writing a day.
wow.
But then I put it into Pro Writing Aid, Scrivener, and then it goes to editors and all that.
Oh, thank you. Leslie.
I write in Scrivener. I use either an AlphaSmart or a FreeWrite, which are like little writing machines, like little freestanding writing things to write my first drafts. But yeah, everything is in Scrivener, and Scrivener saved my life.
Trish.
Scrivener as well. I don't know how I wrote anything before Scrivener, honestly. It's so easy and delightful, and I can see the big picture, the little picture. And I have what is probably the largest ergonomic keyboard known to man that I plug into my laptop because I have bad wrists. So that helps too.
Oh, I put in the wrong link. Okay. Thank you, Emma. Emma's got the right one, but I'll send it to all of the attendees as well. Okay, so let me go back to a couple of these questions. So Effie, also on Facebook, asks, "What are?" Oh, I'm sorry, Harriet. What do you write
That's
in?
fine. I just use Word.
You
Boring.
just Word. Isn't that boring? Because your books are great. Essie says, "What are some of the unique challenges of writing the fantasy romance mashup? Is staying under a goal word count more challenging when you've got a story that could fill a romance novel and a story that could fill a fantasy novel combined in one book?" Leslie.
Yeah, for me, I think it is because fantasy takes longer. Contemporary romance novels can be shorter, anywhere from 40 to 60,000 words. And then a fantasy book, an epic fantasy, is often a doorstopper. So my books now, they're about 130,000 words, but I do have multiple storylines in addition to the main romance storyline. So I consider them like they are like fantasy first and with a strong romance in them. But yeah, balancing that, the two genres, it depends on what your focus is and where your story is. Like I think what Emma was saying, like if the romance is primary, then you're telling a slightly different story than if you're telling a fantasy with a romantic element. And whether you're calling it romantic fantasy or fantasy romance, I think there's different ideas about what those things mean to different people, and then publishers don't really know what that means at all. Like my published books, my traditionally published books are on the fantasy shelf, because there is no fantasy romance shelf at Barnes & Noble or independent bookstores. But some other people's books are on the romance shelf, and that is less actually about what's in the book and more about what your publisher wants to do. And when you're indie, when you're self-published, you make those decisions yourself, and you can kind of do what you feel like doing. So yeah, for me, the word count, all of that is, my publisher wanted longer books because they're putting them on the fantasy shelf. I think if my publisher had wanted to put them on the romance shelf, they might be a little shorter.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. If I ever start a romance bookstore, I will totally have a section for fantasy romance.
Yes, you need your own section.
Trish?
I didn't really pay too much attention to word count with urban fantasy, which is probably why that first book in the Rise of Heroes trilogy is rather on the long side for urban fantasy. I'm paying much more attention to it now with my romance first series that's coming out this summer. But I think maybe because superhero world building can be a little bit more stripped down, you're not necessarily having to justify a magic system or anything like that. You can make it a little on the shorter side. You can make it between about 75 to 90, unless you're doing some deep world building in terms of the science behind the super serum and stuff like that, which I didn't do because I'm not scientific. I just kind of glazed over it and I was like, you can make it up yourself, reader. But yeah, I don't really worry too much about it unless I'm getting really close to the 100,000 word mark, which just doesn't fit where I'm working. There's not a lot of superhero novels that, first of all, really need that kind word count, but also in that small niche of the fantasy genre, it's not normal to have it like that. 90,000 is generally speaking kind of the longest. And so I can get it under that. And if I start to get over that, then I have to start looking at, okay, where do I need to cut back? Is this really 2 books instead of 1? That kind of thing. But generally I don't really worry too much about it.
Okay. Harriet?
Yeah, I don't worry a huge amount about it. I think being self-published, you have a bit more leeway, so you have to worry a little bit less about conventions, although I think obviously it's worth bearing those in mind. So all of my books are somewhere between 80 and 100,000 words. For me, it's more about what am I trying to do with the story, and I don't want anything superfluous in there, but I also want to do justice to the things I'm writing. Mine tend to be, I tend not to try and write like really long, like once it gets over 100,000, just the way that I write and the kind of books that I write, it doesn't necessarily, I don't think it would do me any favors. So I think it's kind of helpful. And again, the way that I write with that kind of what this section and this section and this section, it tends to just somehow come in just over 80,000. Seems to be like the length that I naturally kind of write at. So I don't think about it honestly until I get really close to the end, and then I'm like, ooh, where do I think I'm going to end up with this? I don't worry about it too much.
Wow, 90,000 words. I mean, that sounds insane to me as a non-writer, like I can write like 15 words and it actually makes a good sentence. So
it's short though. It's short for, as Leslie was saying, for the fantasy shelf, that's on the, and also you hear like YouTubers or bookstagrammers talk about them like, oh yeah, this is a little 300 page one. It took me like 5 minutes to read, and you're like, okay, well done.
Yeah. Interesting. Emma?
So I am of 2 minds with this. When I started out, I was writing mostly standalone in a series. So each book would be a different couple. Those books are a lot longer. I think my longest one was like 160,000 words, and I still got so many reviews saying it was too short or the romance felt rushed. So I said, you know what, fine. So now I do very long series with the same couple. And that seemed to have served its purpose, where I kind of write shorter books where they're like 70 to 90,000, and you get to stay with the same people. So it feels a little more realistic, I think, to have that first book where they're like, oh, this person's kind of interesting maybe. And then the second book, they sort of start getting a little more interested. Third book is where you get your heat, and then, continue on with their relationship. So, I mean, I think that there's different ways people manage it. But I definitely, like, word count wise now, I'm staying closer to 70. It's faster to get books out because I'm entirely indie. And I think it's also, people tend to like quicker reads these days, especially with COVID. They just want to power through a whole series. So if I can get, 5-book series out there within 6 months, it's still more words than if I wrote a standalone with just that couple.
So if I do open that romance bookstore, an indie section will also be part of it.
I hate people compare that. I could talk about indie and traditional all day.
It's really interesting. But it's really interesting because a lot of the FaRoFeb authors are indie, and I didn't even realize when I was reaching out to people, I thought that just because of the quality of the covers and their work that they're putting out and their following, you wouldn't even know that there's any difference.
Yeah, there's still very much a stigma out there of like authors, like, that they don't have an editor or they don't have like good cover designers, or, like the stories are not as good. And it's like, no, I'm just a micromanager, and I was not going to wait, 2 years for somebody to decide things for me. And I was like, yeah, I'm good. And I, that was me in the end. Most of my indie friends are also massive micromanagers, so I think it runs in the bloodline there.
Yes, definitely a control freak. I did start indie, and I'm still hybrid, and it's frustrating to have to give up the control to the publisher. I definitely understand.
Especially in fantasy romance, because like you said, I mean, publishers are they're not in fantasy romance yet. So they'll be like, oh, this is the cover. And because you published before, that's not the cover.
Right. And they're thinking about different things than you are as an indie publisher, definitely.
Marketing.
That's really interesting. Like, I find it really interesting that there's all these books that are doing really well who are fantasy romance, but the publishers are kind of lagging a little bit in terms of, and I think, I submitted one to an agent, and they were like, oh, it seems a bit out there, maybe rein it back in, keep it a bit more like something like witches, write about witches. It's like, okay, I don't want to write about witches. But I mean, I love witches, but I'm like, which is not where I am right now.
Yep.
Trish, I saw you pointing to yourself at that at some point too.
Oh yeah, the control freak aspect. I remember after having written the first book, kind of figuring out, what do I want to do, and very clearly sitting and watching a panel of authors. And this one author, she's a female author, and she writes these thrillers with a female detective. And the publisher insisted that, well, because it's a female lead, we have to market it to women. So it's a very dark, kind of scary thriller. And instead of making that the cover kind of sell that, they had hot pink swirly script on it. I mean, just the complete opposite. And she was like, it tanked, and then they cut me loose because the book didn't do well. And I remember sitting there horrified and thinking, oh, no, I want the control of that. If it's gonna flop, I want it to be on me, not factors outside of my control. And it is a steep learning curve because, you talk about the covers and how professional they are. That was a hard one lesson for me. The covers I have now are my third set because that's a marketing tool, and I had a hard time wrapping my head around it. And now I get it. Now I can switch between the author hat and the publisher hat. And the publisher hat is very logical, and it's very, this is what's going to sell this book, even if the super suits on the cover don't look like the ones I described. That's okay. Nobody's going to care about that. I just need to convey this. And I love it. I found out, actually, I love making those decisions. I love doing the market research. I talk about spreadsheets. I have spreadsheets for that. I have spreadsheets for all of that. And I really find that this was my career path. I nothing against anybody that takes the traditional route, like, because this is not for everybody. It's a lot of hard work. And traditional publishing is hard work in a different way. But I don't think I would have done well with a publisher, just my personality and how much I like to be in control of things. I think it would have been a bad mix.
So it's really fascinating to hear the different aspects of the different ways of publishing books. And I think as a reader, we really don't care how we get it as long as we get it.
Right.
There is something in there though, because you fun fact, most people are more likely to pick up a blue covered book than any other color.
Interesting.
So there's like these little weird things that, like, when you're designing your cover, especially if you look at like any of like the big #1 sellers in any genre, it depends on the genre. Urban fantasy is like yellows and reds. That goes really well. But fantasy romance, paranormal romance, for some reason, blue.
Blue.
Don't know why.
So
I'm adding that to the spreadsheet. That's really good to know.
A little color chart for your book covers. Actually, I have a little follow-up question about that, because a lot of indie book authors don't get their books into libraries because librarians tend to not put in books in the library that have not been reviewed by Kirkus or Library Journal or something like that. And that's not the only reason, but have you found it easier, or has it gotten better to get your books into libraries in the more recent years?
No. No. And it's kind of a double-edged sword, because I understand why people would want a Kirkus review. That's huge to be like quality-wise, that's level for a library. But as far as like the marketing end for authors, a Kirkus review doesn't sell books. So why would I spend $500 to get that when it does nothing for me? So libraries in general grab our books, especially if you're not publishing your paperbacks through Ingram Spark, because there's a couple different other options that, yeah, there's, so if you're not through Ingram Spark, you're probably not going to be in the library.
Getting your ebooks into libraries has gotten easier with Hoopla and Overdrive. But yeah, as an indie, to get a print book into libraries, other than your local libraries who might have a local author shelf, then it is difficult. Yeah, like I was able to get, when I was indie, I only got my book into libraries because I had the Star Publishers Weekly Review, which it was through a program that they have for indie authors that you can submit your book, and if they choose you and if they choose to review you, then there's a lot of, it's like the gatekeepers, and it's understandable because there's so many books, and so libraries have a budget and they have to have some sort of criteria, so it's understandable. But it does, because indie authors, you become indie because you don't want to deal with the gatekeepers and you want that control and you want to be able to put things out. And there is an audience there for everyone's books. There's enough people out there that want to read these things. But then the onus is on you to find them and tell them about your book. And yeah, so I think that there's various programs in place. And with ebooks, it is a little bit better. But yeah, the print side is still difficult.
That's true. We've been working on that. I'll keep working on it. So I have a question here in the chat from Vila. It's for Leslie, but I'm going to add a little bit to it so everybody can answer it. Vila says, I have a question for Leslie after staying up most of the night because I could not stop reading Song of Blood and Stone. The complex relationships between Lagrimar, Elsira, and the other cultures in your fantasy world are so compelling and relevant. What inspired the different factions, and what are your world building processes like while coming up with the different tensions and prejudices between the countries? And I think that I'll start with Leslie, of course, but it would be really interesting for me to hear from the other authors about how, in your world building, how do you create tension within the world and not between the characters necessarily? So Leslie, if you'd like to answer Villa's question.
Yeah, so one of the first, those images that I had, these people, one people have magic and one people don't. And one people have dark skin and one people have lighter skinned. And so there's these automatic factions between these countries and these people. And then and they'd been at war for 500 years. And I knew initially that they had been at war. And so then I came up with the reasons why they're at war. Why do they hate each other? What are the differences that they focused on? Because I think it's natural throughout humanity that we focused on differences as ways to find reasons to hate each other and to fight with one another. And so that all just came out of my belief that fantasy is a way to hold up a mirror to our world and take away some of the baggage that we have, but take a look at the way we treat each other and try to figure out ways to maybe treat each other better. So creating the cultures and the world started out with, for me, actually started out with geography. And I figured out, there's these two countries that are different. They've not evolved, but they have different cultures because of the landscape. And that made everything different. That made, from the food that they eat to whatever, and resources. And that's another reason for the war. So I looked at every aspect of humanity, whether it's, climate, geography, economics, transportation, language, music, art, all of that stuff, and tried to ground it in reality and make every country distinct, because there's two main countries, but then as the series progresses, you go into other countries with their own cultures and their own political and economic systems. And so I didn't know all of it at first. I figured out, like, the first book, Song of Blood and Stone, takes place in one country. And then the second book, you go to another one, and then a third one. And so I'm expanding the world. And I didn't know all of these details until I had gotten into those, next books. But growing up Black in America sort of necessitated me thinking about the world in a different way. And I put that into my books in a way that wasn't just about skin color. Like, that's one thing, and then it's also many other things that keep people apart and create unique cultures, but opportunities for conflict and for misunderstanding and for division.
Thank you. That's so true. Trish.
So most of the books are set in the 60s. The first book is a little bit that takes place in the 1940s, but the vast majority of it is an alternate Earth in the 1960s. And so the 60s, of course, is a very tumultuous time in American history. We had so much going on, and I decided, instead of putting it all in there, which felt a little overwhelming to me, in addition to having to add the world building of superheroes, I just picked some things that really resonated with me. And so one of those was the civil rights movement. So I have people of color in my books, like in the first trilogy, the person that creates all the tech that the heroes use, she's a Black woman, and she's genius level inventor, scientist, but she was unable to go to college. So I have that Alice, who's a white woman, she was able to go to college. And so I have it where she's sneaking textbooks, you know, for her, and the conflict of this character wants more and she's completely limited. And so it's her, you know, her friendship with Alice, and that there's a little bit of conflict there. It's like she sees that Alice has all these opportunities and she doesn't. And then in the other trilogy that focuses on Colleen is also African American, and the first book takes place in the Deep South, which in the 1960s was not a safe place for a person of color. And I have it where it really limits her ability to get, because she's on a mission, and they're trying to figure out how to get this person, this powered child, to safety, and they're trekking through the swamps. And whereas for the person, the other character who's white, she's like, why don't we just go to the next town? And Colleen's like, no, I can't do that. So it forces them then to have to find an alternative way to get this person to safety. Mm-hmm. But then I also kind of, and I do want to say, as a white person writing that, I had sensitivity readers, which is one thing I highly recommend if you're going to do something like that and use that as part of your world building to create conflict. You want to have a sensitivity reader to make sure that you're not veering off into damaging stereotypes or tropes or anything like that. And so I had that, and the sensitivity readers actually were like, well, you're missing opportunities with this, this, and this. And it helped create more conflict. It helped broaden the character's scope in terms of like how she relates to her family and other relationships. And so it was really amazing. But the other thing I did was, these people have powers, and in the way I have it in the books, these are fairly new developments. It's just the world is just now really starting to see powers come to the forefront. And I was thinking, well, for the average person, that's going to be really scary. So how would the government respond to that? So I have a secret government agency that goes and like hunts them down, and that's another added layer, in particular with Colleen's series. She runs into that very heavily. So she's got the racial prejudice of the world against her, and then she has government prejudice against her as a person with superpowers on top of it. And so it created a lot of different layers of conflict and difficulty for those characters. I think I answered the question. I feel like I went like roundabout way to get there.
I heard some semblance of answer.
Okay, sorry. I realized I'm in love with my world, obviously, so I'm rambling a little bit. Okay. But that's kind of how I infused some conflict into the world at large, and that it affected the characters.
Mm-hmm. Harriet.
I really like what Leslie said around holding a mirror up. You know, fantasy is a really great opportunity for us to hold a mirror up to our own world, and I feel like that's something that really I find really inspirational, is kind of looking into our world and seeing what horrible, crazy things we're doing, and kind of transporting those into a fantasy setting. So the concept of energy in my books is both about personal energy, but also about energy at large and natural resources and the state of the world. And and I think that's something that obviously is a huge issue within our world, and global warming and how we produce our energy in our world is something that is a huge cause for concern. And so I wanted to really parallel that in my world and make that the cause, something that was a source of conflict for the characters, and something that they had to deal with in exactly the same way that it's now a source of conflict in our world, and we're going to have to deal with it. Equally, things like political systems. So I think there's a lot wrong with a lot of the political systems in our world, I won't go into the politics because frankly, we're talking about fantasy romance, so let's not drag ourselves down. But, you know, all of that complexity around how we rule ourselves, you know, for me, there's no real right or wrong way to rule, lead, manage vast numbers of people. And, you know, I think that complexity can provide a lot of conflict, which can be quite intriguing in a kind of Game of Thrones-esque kind of way. You know, so I, you know, put a lot of that into my books. Things like our obsession with celebrity for absolutely no reason, you know, that things like that. Yeah, I just love taking things that we have in our world, which are ridiculous, and then kind of, you know, transporting them into this fantasy setting and thinking how would they maybe play out in a different world, which causes all this tension for the characters in kind of interesting ways.
Thank you. Emma?
For me, since I write mostly historical, I am the person that is packing as much obscure historical knowledge as possible into a book so that it doesn't feel like you're learning anything, but you definitely are. So, you know, kind of my big complete series is Celtic mythology, and Ireland in general has this very unique godlike system where their gods change, and that is one of the only, if not the only, god system where you actually progressively see the gods and goddesses become different people as Ireland is starting to change and see, you know, more people coming in and more people ruling their lands and that kind of stuff. So, you know, there's a great opportunity in there to kind of reflect, like, this isn't the first time. There's, not to get too historical, Morrigan is actually 3 people, maiden mother crone, but they were people. So Macha is the mother. So early Irish mythology, she's like this hearth goddess, very kind, very sweet, you know, the mom. And then Ireland was invaded, and she became all of a sudden this like warrior goddess through this myth that she married a mortal man from somewhere else and got pregnant, and he wanted her power. So she ended up challenging him to a race for some reason, which she did 9 months pregnant, and she beat him at the end and then has the baby, and right before she dies says she's going to curse him and his line. So that's like, you know, there's conflict in history that is mirrors what's going on now. I think that there's a lot of interesting features in that like, this isn't new. Like, humans in general kind of have this cycle that they go through. So you can take historical, you can take, you know, modern, you can take future, and it's all going to feel very, you're going to recognize it.
Thank you. I have a quick question from Facebook from Madison. We'll just go around really quick. Do you write a certain number of words every day, and do you prefer mornings, evenings, or whenever the muse hits to write? I'll start with Trish for that.
I generally, when I'm first doing that discovery draft, I try to hit between 1,500 and 2,000 words a day. And I really like to write in the morning. And so I'm part of superhero authors Discord, and somebody's in there all the time doing writing sprints. And so I'll go in and we'll sprint however many words you can write in 20 minutes. And it helps to do it with other people. It doesn't feel so solitary for me, but I do try to stick to a schedule of, in the morning, you know, 20-minute sprints for the discovery draft. And then editing is not necessarily a word count, but more like, I want to get this many chapters revised or edited today. And same thing, I'll set aside about an hour in the morning, hour and a half in the morning. Whatever works with my kids, honestly. Sometimes the morning doesn't, but that's kind of how I do it. I try to treat it as a job, and I schedule it as such, and it just it helps me really get it done.
Thank you. I want to join that group. Harriet.
Again, I've got 2 kids, so everything kind of has to revolve around them, and so it tends to be, and I'm not a morning person, so it tends to be the afternoon, really. So after I picked up my daughter from school, that kind of, I get like maybe an hour in the afternoon, and then in the evenings. So I try and get, when I'm writing, which I'm not at the moment because FaRoFeb's taken over my life, but once February is over and I write again, I tend to do kind of 1,500 to 3,000 words a day, and then editing is just, you know, whatever I can kind of get through. Some bits take longer, some bits take less time. So
Thank you. Emma?
This is my full-time job, so I write all day, every day. I am the prolific one. I write 5 to 10,000 words a day. Generally speaking, I'll do 3 10,000 word days. So I do write 2 books a month, and then I will take a month off and edit forever, which is my least favorite. Because when you're writing that many words and that fast, there tends to be a lot more to fix. But yeah, I've gotten good at editing.
Thank you. Oh my gosh. Wow. Leslie?
So when I'm drafting, I do about 2,000 to 3,000 words a day. And then when I'm editing, it's usually chapters. So I backdate from my deadline and how many chapters do I need to edit each day or each week. I also schedule, I write with a friend every morning at 8 o'clock. So we meet on Google Hangouts and we do sprints. Even if I'm editing, we'll just do it in 20-minute chunks. And then we check in with each other about what we've done. Like we set our goals at the beginning, and then at the end of the 20 minutes, we check in and then we start another sprint. And that's been really helpful because the most helpful writing advice I've ever gotten was do it first. And I run a business. I'm happily child-free, but I do run a business, and got some 4 furry little children around here. But so my time management is between like the writing. If I don't get it done first, then clients will come in and eat up the rest of my day. So I write from anywhere between 8 and 10, 11, 12, depending how much I need to get done. And then I switch gears into my business. So yeah, doing it first in the morning. I used to be like a stay up till 2 a.m. writer, and that just wasn't working. It wasn't conducive to like a good life for me. I'm not a morning person, but I've pushed myself to get up every day and write.
Yeah, for me, writing that late in the night is like writing drunk.
Exactly, yeah. What were those words? I have no idea what I'm doing.
Where did they come from?
I've tried that. There's been a couple of sprints like, let's do midnight sprints. And during NaNoWriMo, I would do that. And then I'd go back and I'm like, what was this? I had to delete it all. It didn't make any sense.
I mean, I really have like a window of time, like between maybe like 8:30 and like 10:30, when I'm like, okay, I'm kind of still able to be sensible and, you know, like broadly make sense. After that, I'm like, no, I need to just call it quits, and tomorrow's another day, you know.
It's interesting that you equate late night writing with drunk writing. That's really funny. So on Facebook, a Free Thinkers Corner says hi to Harriet and Trish.
Hi,
so
Chris.
I have a question before we start really winding down, and this is what I call the shape of water question, which you might have seen the movie. And so writing that movie is like so strange to me because, you know, this creature and this woman have a love affair. So like, I'm not completely sure where you guys are on the scale of sexy writing. But, you know, how do you account for creating creatures that are anatomically different from humans, or do you? I'm going to start with Harriet for this. Sorry, Harriet.
Take one for the team.
I haven't actually ever written any creatures, so I know I was going to say Emma. I'm sure Emma is the girl for this question. My books are kind of, I created for FaRoFeb like a heat level, because I think that's one of the things that people find frustrating about fantasy romance generally, is like, okay, what am I getting myself in for here? Is it like, is that no heat, or is it like going to be crazy heat? So my books are kind of at the lower end, but there's like a lot of tension and usually like 1 or 2 sex scenes in my books, and but they're all with humans, so I can't really answer that question.
I just had to ask it. Okay, Emma, go for it.
Oh boy. All right, so I'm going to use the Otherworld series because that one's finished. So when I first dove into it, I was like, all right, so we'll like create this dude who, when he gets injured, it like splits open like a geode, and you get these cool like amethyst stones coming out, and people like really responded very well to that, especially with placements or, you know, I tend to, with my steamy scenes, like to flip it a little bit. I think that there is something interesting about a woman that is more dominant than a man, and you know, vice versa. So I know the scene that everybody loves in that book is she leaves like bite marks on his shoulders that have stones. But because people were so interested in that, I was like, well, let's see if we can push it further. So then the next character actually has like half a raven head and one eye that moves on its own. That's like a raven. He has like a claw hand and a foot that is also a raven, and that one is way more popular than the first. So I think, especially if you're doing vaguely fairy tale or Beauty and the Beast, you can really get away with a lot. There is a limit. Like, people don't want too much description if it's going to be like a monster. I definitely like, I've read some books that are a little bit more on that end that kind of toe the line too much. But yeah, I mean, I have another series with gargoyles that have big wings and claws and horns, and people love them. So yeah, you can definitely, you can have fun with it. I mean, people fell in love with the Beast. And I know way more people that like the Beast as that than as the prince. So this, I don't know what it is, but we like it.
Thank you, Leslie.
Yeah, I've only ever written humans. I actually don't have creatures in my fantasy world like that. There's magic, but not creatures. And I don't have any ideas that are creature based at the moment. So maybe one day, but as of yet, no. And my heat level is kind of middle high kind of heat.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Trish.
I also don't have any creatures, but it's funny. There was the superhero fiction website I run. We're doing our second annual convention this June, and our most popular panel from last year was the romance panel. And the question that had everybody in stitches was, how do superheroes have sex? Do they use powers in the bedroom? And I've had so many people ask me, when are you going to have superheroes having sex using their powers in the bedroom? And because my urban fantasy, there is sex in there, but it's more of a fade to black. Like, they get going and then it's like fading to black and then the afterglow scene. Whereas my romance first series that's coming out is definitely going to be a lot more steamy. And my editor, she's like, so they have angelic powers. Are they going to have steamy sex as angels? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm going to have to think about that.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think maybe there's one female character that's very interested in if wingspan is an indicator of other body part sizes. So I might have to talk about that. It's going to be a new area for me. I do have a friend that writes more steamy, erotic kind of romance with supers, and she has explored powers in the bedroom, and that has been a lot of fun to read. So I think maybe for the romance series, I might have to have at least one book where they have sex in his angelic form. I don't know, but because they're 7 feet tall, they're huge and they're big, and so I'm like, got to figure that out. But yeah, I haven't done that yet. I it's probably in my future, however.
I'll look forward to that. I recently read a book where there was a mermaid or merman, and I thought, how is this going to work? And then it worked. So
romance author can always make it work.
yeah. I was intrigued though. Like, I was like, how is this author going to do this in a way that I would actually believe that this could happen? And I totally did. Jessica on Facebook says, I love The Faceless Woman by Emma. Bran is awesome.
That's the raven head.
Oh.
I have to read this book now.
Right?
I am so curious now. I have to read this book.
Yep.
I
People love him. He's also like the complicated bad boy. So
nice.
You can't lose with those.
No. So just as a last question, I'm going to ask, what's next for you, and where can we find your books? Because not all of you are traditionally published. So I'm going to start with Emma. What's next? I mean, how are you going to beat the Raven Boy kind of thing? And where can we find your books?
Beating the Raven Boy is easy because it's the Goblin King and everybody loves
Oh,
trickster, silver, silver skin and little ear tufts. So I'm finishing that one. I'm really focusing on that. I do have 2 other books that are sort of passion projects, which are like deep diving into Greek mythology. I will be going back to that. Aphrodite and Hephaestus definitely need a book. But for now, focusing on goblins, and you can find me pretty much everywhere. I'm an Amazon author mostly because Kindle Unlimited, but you should be able to find my paperbacks on Book Depository, Barnes & Nobles, any of those if you want those. I also do book experience boxes with every release, which I might not do them much more because they're a lot of work. But if you want to like open up little tiny packages of things in the actual book that you're reading while you're reading, I do those. So.
okay. I will send out all of your websites in the recap email so that people can see all of your books and find the links to them. Thank you. Leslie.
My next book is the 4th in the series. It's Requiem of Silence. It comes out this August. And that is the final book in the series. So it will be a whole set and you can binge to your heart's content. And you can find my books basically everywhere. My website is lpenelope.com. And I have a weekly podcast where I talk about writing stuff and everything going on that week in my writing world. Yeah.
Thank you. Trish?
My next book is Devil's Desire. It is the first in the Celestial Superheroes series, which is moving my Vigilantes universe to today's timeline, moving it out of the past and into contemporary settings, still alt history, but it is the first romance forward kind of series. And that will be on Amazon. I am a Kindle Unlimited author, and you can find all of my books, including a free prequel or a free novella that goes with the Celestial Superheroes on trishheinrich.com.
I will send out that link. Harriet, last but not least.
Yeah, so my next book, Court of Crystal, is coming out in June, which is the 3rd book in the Relic trilogy, so that will then be complete. And then I have the 1st book in the Reincarnation series, which I don't know what it's going to be called yet, but it's going to be coming out, I don't know when, but afterwards. That will be the next one that comes out afterwards. And I also have a contemporary romance, which I have finished, which I may publish under the same pen name or may publish under a different pen name. Haven't decided exactly what to do with that one yet. But yeah, you can find me on Kindle Unlimited. You can also find me at Free Thinkers Corner in Dover, New Hampshire, and River Run in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, 2 independent bookshops. And bookshop.org is a good place to go if you want to support independent bookshops as well.
Oh, thank you. Actually, one final question is there any way for people to get books of yours signed?
Yes, sorry.
Go ahead.
I can send signed books to people if they request them. I just need an address to do that.
Okay. I saw you. Oh, go ahead, Harriet.
Sorry. A Free Thinkers Corner. If you Google a Free Thinkers Corner in Dover, through that independent bookshop, you can get signed copies from me.
Yep, same. Just reach out and ask, because I'll put it up on Etsy or something similar to that. I used to have it on my website, but we're working on that now. So.
And Leslie?
I do have a store on my website. You can do signed books, and also Charm City Books, which is in Baltimore, has signed copies of my traditionally published books.
Awesome. Yeah, because I think the signed books are gold. So I just had to put that out there. Well, thank you so much for this amazing program. I've learned so much about fantasy romance, your books, and just how important it is for us to have fantasy romance as part of our lexicon, because it brings us out of our own reality, but actually keeps maybe a foot or toe in. So thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I thank you for everybody who's been here, listening here and on Facebook. And like I said, I'll send out a recap with a lot of information, including the video link. But in the meantime, thank you so much, Emma, Leslie, Harriet, and Trish. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Absolutely. It's a really fun panel. So goodbye, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Bye.
Let me just close this. And